Good morning, and my thanks to Desmond and to Alex for having me here. As was mentioned in the introduction, I spent 3 years as a policymaker at the Bank of England, so I am here to provide the economics, at least that's how I view it, of what this will do to the UK and therefore how this affects the relationships with the US and with the EU. I very much agree with a number of Ambassador Sullivan's comments, but I just want to start where he started. I think it's the wrong decision for the UK, but they're entitled to it. So the question is, what happens as a result of making that decision? I like to think of AEI as the place inspired by people mugged by reality. Some of you will remember that famous Irving Kristol quote. And I fear that both several people in Britain and some people on this panel are either in the process of or about to be mugged by reality. The UK definitely had a long-standing ambivalence about membership in Europe, and there is no question that part of the European project and written in the laws is the idea of an ever closer union. And so there was this happy ambivalent state, happy in the sense it was the best anybody was going to do, of the UK being sort of in, sort of out. And that worked pretty well for everybody. But it was not a sustainable equilibrium. It was not a sustainable equilibrium once the euro area became a majority of the member states. It was not a sustainable equilibrium once the foreign policy arm of the EU started to develop more coherence. And it was not a stable equilibrium because there was a cultural current, we can get into why and how, but recurrent throughout Britain and particularly in England, that the EU was a problem, much the same way people decided in this country Washington was a problem. And so this was not going to last. And so we now do have the break. And what are the implications? Well, the implication is very simple. The UK economy is going to suffer what we call a negative supply shock, and in fact is already doing so. What is a negative supply shock? A negative supply shock means you are reducing the productive capacity of your economy or the ability of your economy to purchase things for the same amount of money as you used to. And this takes several forms. Fundamentally, and again, this is something that I would hope in AEI would be religion. It is across the street at my shop. Putting up trade barriers is bad for your economy. The withdrawal from the EU is a form of putting up trade barriers. Full stop. Now, you can debate how much, how big, which industries, what happens in the end, but it is a withdrawal. Moreover, and this relates to some of the things Ambassador O'Sullivan said, it is a negative supply shock in that you are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life, that gravity applies. What is gravity? You trade far, far more with the countries you are contiguous with and the countries that you historically have interacted with than with countries that are far away. That is true for the US in the context of NAFTA. That is true for the UK. No matter how much there's been a special relationship, no matter how much the UK tries to be a global exporter, the fact is you've got more than twice as much trade with the EU, more than twice as much investment with the EU as you do with the US, or let alone the rest of the world. As David Cameron pointed out when Prime Minister while I was at the Bank of England, the UK does more trade with Ireland than they do with the BRIC countries combined, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is negative, full stop. And even if we were to get the kind of UK-US trade deal that Ambassador Bolton puts forward, I don't think we will, and I'll explain that at the very end if we have time. But even if we were, it would not matter very much compared to this shock. Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand those production, will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access. Fourth, there's a distinction that gets made, and it was sort of there in Ambassador Bolton, and it was more there in Ambassador O'Sullivan's comments, which is important. There's a distinction between a trade deal and access to the single market. The single market is covering all those things that aren't simply the price of goods off the boat. It's whether your auto meets safety standards. It's whether your chemicals or your food additives have been recognized. It's whether you fit standard sizes of various objects. It's whether your accountants are accredited. It's whether your university degree is recognized in other countries' universities. Now, there's a large body of research in the US and Europe, some of it written at AEI, that says many of these things are restraints from trade. In reality, they are partially restraints from trade and partially economically beneficial because they set standards and make it easier to have large markets. In any given industry, there'll be more or less of those attributes. But so then the question is, since the UK primarily is an exporter of high-end products and of services especially, financial services, business services, media services, cultural services, educational services, how much do they lose by not being in the single market, even if you have a trade deal? And the answer is a lot. Most of the financial regulation that affected the UK was set in the UK and was not set by Brussels. And while the UK was in the EU, they had a predominant voice in the setting of those regulations in Brussels. Now, there will be no such interest. And that is why we are seeing, on estimates of my colleague Simeon Jankov, who runs the financial markets group at the London School of Economics, a third of city jobs, the economic and financial jobs in the City of London, will be moving to Dublin, Frankfurt, New York. So, full stop, this is bad economically. Now you can say, but this is for centuries. Over the long term, it'll be better. So then you have to think about what's wrong with the EU economy versus the UK economy. So most of us who see there being problems in the EU economy as a whole, or at least the Euro area economy, because frankly Eastern Europe isn't doing so bad, tend to focus on 5 things. We say there's over-regulation of labor markets, there's heavy hand of regulation and other things, there's an excessive welfare state, there's demographic decline, and there's the problems of being associated with the Euro membership. Now, if you look at that list, 4 of those 5 do not apply to the UK, even as members of the EU. The UK has a looser labor market regulations than anyone else in the EU. The UK has a smaller welfare state than anyone else in the EU. The UK was a beneficiary in a demographic sense of people from Poland and France and Portugal and elsewhere and Romania coming and helping balance out the aging of their society. And the UK was, of course, not a member of the European monetary system. Even if the UK were to stay in the EU, none of that would change. So what is it getting? So you're balancing essentially non-financial regulation in certain areas being excessive versus all the other stuff I spoke about, and giving up the ability to affect or push back against those regulations in future because you will no longer be a member. Leave the rhetoric aside. Look at the reality. This is not a very good deal in economic terms. Now, again, you can always say, well, this is about sovereignty. They want to do it. Again, I'm not fit to say that. That's fine. But you should be aware that there is no economic upside to this. So let me just be predictive in my remaining 3.5 minutes. What's going to happen? I agree with Ambassador Bolton that there is no going back right now in the UK. There is the election was not about Brexit. I completely agree with him on that. What is perhaps ironic for people to understand is the real reason the election was not about Brexit and there's no turnaround on Brexit is not because of anything to do with the Tory government. It's to do with the fact that the current extreme left-wing leadership of the Labour Party is horribly anti-Europe. Corbyn and McDonnell are viscerally anti-Europe. Corbyn voted against the European Union back in '74 and consistently since. Again, that's his right. But if the Labour leadership were different, you could have a Remain vote, come back, as long as the Labour leadership is these two nut jobs, and it will remain these two nut jobs for the foreseeable future, run by the unions, you will not see a Remain vote. So the UK is going to have to cope with this economic aspect. They're going to have higher inflation, lower purchasing power, weaker pound. The pound has a ways to go yet because it mostly declined against the dollar, where, as I mentioned, there's more than twice as much trade and investment with Europe as with the dollar. So it has to adjust further against Europe. As my colleague, Lord Mervyn King, from the bank, then the governor of the Bank of England, used to point out, the UK had a huge set of imbalances. The UK has very large budget deficits, has very large trade deficits. At some point, that means they're living beyond their savings, they have to pay it back. Well, what we've seen over the last few years and in the run-up since the Brexit is that we've seen a further boost of consumer borrowing, while corporate investment has gone negative and trade has gone the wrong way. So in other words, the household balance sheets are getting worse, the government balance sheet is getting worse, the trade balance sheet is getting worse, at the same time that they are now going to be pulling themselves out of economies of scale in their biggest markets. And at the same time that there is inflation, which means the real purchasing power and ability to pay off those debts is going to go down. Not good. Do the mental exercise. If this was 1974 Britain, and you were on a fixed exchange rate and you had this set of macroeconomic indicators, you would be predicting a pound crash. Thankfully, Great Britain, UK, is not part of the euro area, does not have a fixed exchange rate. But if you do that exercise, it reminds you of just how unsustainable the current British path is. So then you have to go further into being mugged by reality. In this game, given that economic situation, what does the UK do? Well, the Theresa May government has made very clear that they intend to try to become Singapore on the Thames. They want to become the city-state alternative to the overregulated Europe. There are a dozen problems with this, but I will highlight one in particular. That Theresa May came out repeatedly saying, well, the way we're going to get around these immigration restrictions, which we're going to put in place, we're going to make it hard for EU people to have secured citizenship in the UK, we're going to control our borders, you know that phrase, and not let all this cheap labor and foreigners and Eastern Europeans in. But yet, all of business is really mad about this. Well, we're going to start allocating on an industry by industry, if not company by company basis, through our government, permits of who gets how many immigrants in which industry for the rest of the time. Again, this should be anathema to anyone in this building in AEI. It certainly is anathema to any market economist. Basically, this is the labor market program of the pre-Thatcher industrial policies of the Labour Party in the 70s and the 60s, which Theresa May wants to reimpose on the British economy. So don't entertain the fantasy that this is going to make Britain this wonderful, like Hong Kong was in the 70s. It's going to make Britain like Britain was in the 70s. That is a step backward. That is a step away from freedom. That is a step away from prosperity. Again, as we've seen repeatedly, and not just in this country, popular votes at any given time can select things that are in bad self-interest. And political factors can rightly overcome economic concerns. But let us not mistake what are the actual economic implications of Brexit. And finally, I'll end on the fact of also what are the values. Because as people at AEI have repeatedly argued, rightly, the arguments for free markets are not just about economic efficiency, as Arthur Brooks has pointed out. They're about morality, they're about openness, they're about interchange with other peoples, they're about foreign policy. The people who voted for Brexit and the choices they are making to emphasize border control and symbolism of the European Court of Justice is an ideology that is about what we call in Britain Little England. It is an ideology that is ethno-nationalist. It is an ideology that distrusts free markets and competition. It is an ideology that distrusts change. Again, they have the right to do this, but do not kid yourself about what the values are. They are not values anything anyone in this building should support. I do want to second Ambassador O'Sullivan on some of the pushback on Ambassador Bolton about who's responsible for what. And it also, I think, is instructive for today. In September 1992, I was sitting in Chancellor Kohl's office the day the UK dropped out of the exchange rate mechanism, okay? This was an accident of history that I happened to be there. It had no effect on anything, I can assure you, but I was there, okay? And so there are two important lessons from my having sat there that day that I would apply to today's discussion. The first is Kohl, like Merkel now, is about German self-interest. They may like the automakers, they may like the ideal of Europe, and as David has argued, they view that as in Germany's enlightened self-interest. But they are not going to just roll over for this, that, or the other, as has been seen repeatedly throughout the European crisis. And so when Ambassador Bolton is introduced as someone fighting in the bio, I think you read out fighting vociferously or some other word for American national interest, the Germans, chancellors, fight pretty hard for German interest. And Helmut Kohl was perfectly content to watch the UK go bye-bye. That was a call from John Major. He left the room. He came back in the room, offered me a piece of cake. Kohl, like me, was a little overweight. And I said, well, you know, what? And he's like, no, it's up to Britain. They want out, they get out. That was September 92, the exchange rate mechanism. So don't overdo the idea that Chancellor Merkel or the Germans or the Europeans are going to be cowed because a few German auto workers may be out of work. Remember, 18,000 employees is 1/20th of 1% of the German workforce. And there's huge overcapacity in the auto industry. Second point is about this issue of, is there going to be a UK-US trade deal? Again, this is one of those things where there's no question President Trump and the Trump administration has the power, has the right, if they choose to tear up the queue or the Disney line or whatever is the American way of saying you sequence things. They want to have start a trade deal with US-UK tomorrow, they can. Question is, should it happen, will it happen? Should it happen? The Trump administration turned its back on the TPP deal, which, as my colleague John Hamre, president of CSIS, pointed out at Peterson yesterday, was the single biggest strategic thing the US could have done to support its allies and stop Chinese influence in Asia. And you're going to argue that this is somehow a strategic priority because we have some affinity with the stuff on Masterpiece Theater. You can do that. And in fact, it probably wouldn't surprise me if the Trump administration did that, but it's hardly pursuing US strategic interests to just piss off, excuse my language, to annoy the largest economic bloc in the world. I don't see what the point is, especially if the Trump administration's trade attitude, as expressed in its statements yesterday about NAFTA, is what they care most about are bilateral trade deficits, and they want to press bilateral strength and advantages wherever they can. Okay then, so you're going to give the UK a trade deal in which you bully them to make sure that they are importing more from the US than they're exporting. And what purpose will that serve? Don't know. Maybe it'll be a big victory and make up for the fact that Mexico isn't going to import more from the US as a result of NAFTA. You know, it's just, you can do it, but it doesn't make any sense strategically or economically. And there was a sense in which TPP, as I think Bob Zellick argued, TPP was a template. Ambassador O'Sullivan mentioned the idea of templates being useful in trade negotiations. If we had TPP, the US had specifically made sure that TPP, even though it had a geographic title in its name, had no limits on geographic membership. So we could have just extended TPP membership to the UK. It would have been at all the standards that we would have wanted from anybody. It would have been totally open to them. It would have given them access not just to the US, but to all these growing Asian markets, as Mr. Gurdon mentioned that those are where the growth is, but of course we threw that away. First, I want to strongly support and associate myself with Desmond's response to Mr. Gurdon on the idea that this isn't neutral. It isn't neutral in two senses. One, strongly echoing Desmond, that as I predicted a year and a half ago, or you can read my column from the FT from a year ago, June 26th, in which I said the dangers of an offshore Britain are that economic desperation will lead to races to the bottom and lead to bad favoring of industries and all these other things, which we know, as Desmond rightly points out, promote populism. The second thing, which I'll say, even if not implicating anyone else, which I directly contradict Mr. Gurdon, is it is naive at best to pretend that there is no racial component to this. If you look at the voting patterns in the UK, there is a very strong, statistically significant positive correlation between the diversity of the voting districts and the share that voted for Brexit. Full stop. It's almost a sufficient statistic to explain the vote. And you can say, well, that's something else, but I'm afraid I tend to look at facts. The final thing I would say, and I don't get into the process stuff like Ambassador O'Sullivan did. Let's talk about effects. For anyone who's talking about the freedom of Eastern Europe or the freedom attained by US military preventing and the NATO preventing Soviet incursions, talking about the transition to democracy in Spain and Portugal and Greece, as Ambassador O'Sullivan rightly did, or the US past, to talk about somehow political oppression of people in Britain in the last 20 years is shameful. All of you have seen, there is no meaningful political oppression. Again, you can decide as a British citizen that the symbols of what you vote on are very important to you. Legally, that's your right. But let's not gussy this up as though this is some great blow for freedom. We have all seen in our lifetimes what's going on. We are all seeing what's happening in Poland and Turkey right now and Venezuela. That's oppression. There's nothing the EU is doing to oppress the people of the UK. I have a little bit of a political science background, so forgive me if I raise a different tack, which is referendum democracy is not the only way to do democracy. There's a reason why the US was a republic. There's a reason why in Britain, even though they've chosen to ignore it now, Parliament is sovereign, not the popular vote. The popular vote is binding in the political sense, but is in no sense legally or constitutionally binding in Europe, in the UK. So, putting it differently, a poll just came out in the German press that a third of Bavarians would like to secede from Germany. I think it came out yesterday in Die Zeit. No, in Die Welt. You know, you don't want elected officials or the appointees of elected officials completely ignoring popular opinion, but there's a reason why constitutions get drawn up with less degrees of responsiveness to popular opinion.
Hi, thank you very much for the stimulating discussion. I'm Lila Afas with Toyota. I think one of the interesting impacts of Brexit was that you saw the pound devalue immediately, and typically in economics theory that leads to an increase in exports, but we haven't seen that happen. And a lot of the cause for that, many suspect, is because of the global supply chains, and although the pound may be lower, Britain still relies upon so many components. What other impacts do you think coming out of Brexit will sort of defy traditional economic theory? And also, Adam, as you said, the withdrawal was a protectionist measure. What other protectionist measures may the UK look at to protect itself, given the prognosis that you provided, and other things that they might do or other mechanisms they may put in place as well?
Okay, I think that's, yes.
Thank you. So I want to provide a tiny bit more context to this. You're absolutely right, Lila. There is this weird phenomenon of pound declined a lot, and the trade gap in the UK hasn't appreciably changed much. But actually, when I was in the UK, we saw a similar thing at the start of the crisis, where the trade-weighted pound declined by 25% roughly, and over the course of over the course of 2009. And the trade gap didn't change very much. And at the time, the staff at the Bank of England, and I was kibitzing on that, was very concerned by this because it seemed weird. And what we decided at the time as a tentative explanation was there were several factors. One was what you mentioned, that the UK is at a high intermediate point in a lot of supply chains. So whether it's autos or expertise on oil extraction or various, even financial services of certain kinds, they require a bunch of inputs, literally imported inputs, whether it's people or car parts, before they can be exported. And so the net gain you get is limited. And the same is true of Japan, and we see this in Japan, that the decline in the value of the yen in recent years has not had as big an impact as we expected. A second point is that there was a secular hit, meaning a lasting targeted problem for the financial services industry. The financial services industry in the UK was at its height about 15% of GDP. It's now down to fluctuating between 10 and 12%. That's a very big change for a major economy, and very sudden. And this had to do with the combination of the financial crisis, scandals and problems within the UK, over-reliance on this, and now, of course, compounded by the shift of some of those financial services to Ireland, Germany, Netherlands, wherever. And so that's something that the exchange rate isn't going to entirely make up for. So it's less a phenomenon, I think, of economic theory not working, and more a phenomenon of the usual economist's excuse. And I'm sure the non-economists on the panel can make fun of this, That's true, ceteris paribus, everything else equal, not everything else was held constant. But in this case, that's what's happening. Let me turn to this.
Before I